The summer heat in Crenshaw County, Alabama, hung thick as molasses on the evening of July 15th, 1995. Cicadas buzzed their relentless chorus from the pine trees that lined Highway 331, and the air shimmered with humidity that made even breathing feel like work. At the Harris household on Maple Street, 16-year-old Jake Harris was loading his tackle box into the bed of his cousin Tommy's rusted Ford pickup, the same truck that would be found empty and abandoned 12 hours later, its doors hanging open like broken wings in the pre-dawn mist. Jake's mother, Carol, watched from the kitchen window as her son checked his fishing rod one last time, running his calloused fingers along the guides with the practiced care of someone who'd been casting lines since he could barely hold a pole. 15-year-old Tommy Wilson bounced on his heels beside the truck, his excitement palpable even from a distance. The boys had been planning this night fishing trip to Perdido Creek for weeks, waiting for the new moon phase when the catfish would be biting heavy in the deep pools where the creek curved through the bottomland. Something felt different that night, though Carol couldn't name what it was. Maybe it was the way Jake lingered at the door before leaving, or how he'd hugged her just a beat longer than usual. "We'll be back before sunrise, Mama," he'd promised, his voice carrying that casual confidence that only teenage boys possess. "Tommy knows a spot where the big ones hide." She'd kissed his forehead, tasting the salt of his sweat, and watched the taillights disappear into the gathering darkness, never imagining she'd just seen her son alive for the last time. The creek access road where Tommy parked his truck was nothing more than a dirt path that wound through stands of loblolly pine and sweet gum trees, the kind of hidden spot that only locals knew about. It was the same place their fathers had fished as boys, and their grandfathers before them, a generational secret passed down through whispered conversations about the deep holes where channeled catfish lurked in the shadows. The water moved slow and dark here, carrying the earthy scent of decomposing leaves and the promise of good fishing for those patient enough to wait for the fish to bite. By 6:30 the next morning, when neither boy had returned home and Tommy's truck sat empty at the creek access road, Carol Harris knew with a mother's terrible intuition that something had gone wrong. The fishing gear lay scattered in the red Alabama clay like abandoned toys, tackle boxes spilled open, their contents glinting in the early morning sun, hooks and sinkers scattered across the ground like fallen stars. Rods tangled in the tall grass that grew wild along the bank, their lines cut or broken, as if whatever had happened here had happened fast and violent. One rod, Jake's favorite basscaster with the worn cork handle that fit his grip perfectly, was found nearly 100 yards away, partially hidden beneath a fallen log, as if it had been thrown there in haste or panic. The sight of it lying there, abandoned and useless, sent a chill through Carol that had nothing to do with the morning air. Her son would never willingly leave that rod behind. He'd saved his lawn mowing money for 3 months to buy it from Hancock Sporting Goods, and he treated it like a sacred relic. The silence at the creek was absolute, except for the gentle lapping of water against the muddy banks and the distant call of a mockingbird hidden somewhere in the trees. No signs of struggle marked the ground, no blood stained the fishing spot, no obvious clues pointed toward what had become of 2 teenage boys who'd simply wanted to catch some catfish on a hot summer night. The stories that matter most often begin with moments like these, when ordinary lives collide with the inexplicable, leaving families forever changed and communities haunted by questions that refuse to fade. Sheriff Bobby Ray Hutchins had been wearing the badge for just 3 years when the call came in about the missing Wilson and Harris boys. He arrived at Perdido Creek to find Tommy's father, Dennis Wilson, standing knee-deep in the murky water, calling his son's name, until his voice cracked and broke. The creek moved slow and dark between its banks, carrying secrets in its current that wouldn't give up their dead easily. Hutchins could see the fear in Dennis's eyes, the same fear that was spreading through the small crowd of family members and early-rising neighbors who'd already gathered at the scene. Dennis Wilson was a man carved from Alabama clay and determination. his hands permanently stained with motor oil from 30 years of running Wilson's auto repair on the edge of town. But standing there in that creek, water seeping through his work boots and soaking his jeans, he looked small and lost, a father confronting every parent's worst nightmare. "They know this creek like the back of their hands," he kept repeating to anyone who would listen, his voice growing hoarse from shouting the boys' names into the humid morning air. Something ain't right here. Something ain't right at all. Within 2 hours, Hutchins had called in every favor he could muster. The Alabama Department of Public Safety sent a helicopter that chopped the humid air above the tree line, its rotors beating a metallic rhythm that echoed off the water. The aircraft swept back and forth in methodical patterns, its spotlight cutting through the canopy of leaves even in broad daylight, searching for any sign of movement or color that didn't belong to the natural landscape. From the ground, the helicopter sounded like mechanical thunder, a promise that help had arrived even as it highlighted just how vast and unforgiving this stretch of Alabama wilderness could be. Volunteers arrived from 3 counties over, men with bloodhounds and women with sandwiches, all of them understanding that in a place like Crenshaw County, when children go missing, the whole community becomes family. The Crenshaw County Volunteer Fire Department organized search parties that fanned out through the woods in careful grids, calling the boys' names every few minutes and listening for responses that never came. Local hunters who knew every deer trail and fishing hole within a 20-mile radius joined the effort, their knowledge of the terrain invaluable in terrain that could swallow a person whole if they didn't know where they were going. The dogs picked up the boys' scent easily enough from their abandoned fishing gear, following it to the creek's edge where it simply vanished, as if Jake Harris and Tommy Wilson had walked into the water and dissolved like sugar in sweet tea. Ranger, a German Shepherd mix belonging to volunteer searcher Bill Murphy, whined and paced along the bank, his frustration mirroring that of the humans around him. The dog could smell something, but whatever trail he was following led nowhere, ending abruptly at the water's edge, like a sentence cut off mid-thought. As the day wore on and the sun climbed higher, turning the Alabama humidity into something almost unbearable, the search expanded to cover 50 square miles of creek bottom, pine forest, and farmland. Deputies from neighboring counties arrived with their own dogs and equipment, and the State Bureau of Investigation sent 2 agents who set up a command post in the parking lot of Perdido Creek Baptist Church. The parking lot filled with patrol cars, volunteer vehicles, and the kind of controlled chaos that emerges when a community refuses to give up hope. But as the second night fell and the boys remained missing, a terrible reality began to settle over the search teams like dust after a long drought. Experienced searchers knew that after 24 hours, the chances of finding missing persons alive dropped dramatically, especially in terrain this unforgiving. The creek connected to the Conecuh River system, which meant the boys could have been carried miles downstream if they'd somehow fallen in. The surrounding forests were dense enough to hide a dozen bodies, and the summer heat would accelerate decomposition if the worst had happened. If you're drawn to these forgotten cases, these stories that time tried to bury, make sure you're subscribed, because what the searchers couldn't know was that they were looking for the boys in all the wrong places. The Harris and Wilson families had been inseparable for as long as anyone in Crenshaw County could remember. Carol Harris and Linda Wilson were sisters who had married brothers, creating a web of relationships so tight that their children grew up more like siblings than cousins. Their houses sat only 3 blocks apart on quiet residential streets where children still played kick the can until the streetlights came on, and where neighbors knew each other's business with the comfortable intimacy of small-town life. But in the weeks following July 15th, that closeness became both a blessing and a curse, a source of shared strength that also magnified their collective anguish. Linda Wilson threw herself into the search with the desperate energy of a woman who refused to accept the unthinkable. She transformed her kitchen table into a command center, covering it with photocopied flyers bearing the boys' smiling faces, maps marked with colored pins indicating where searches had been conducted, and manila folders stuffed with contact information for every law enforcement agency in the Southeast. The missing person posters she created became a familiar sight throughout Alabama and beyond, taped to gas station windows, grocery store bulletin boards, and the windshields of cars in church parking lots. "Have you seen these boys?" the flyers asked in bold letters, above photographs that captured Jake and Tommy in happier times, fishing poles in hand, and grins wide enough to break a mother's heart. Linda's obsession with finding her son consumed every waking hour. She drove the back roads of Crenshaw County until she knew every dirt path and hunting trail by heart, stopping at farmhouses and trailer parks to show the photographs to anyone who would look. Her husband Dennis watched helplessly as his wife grew thinner and more hollow-eyed with each passing day, surviving on coffee and determination while sleep became an impossible luxury. "I know they're out there somewhere," she would tell anyone who listened, her voice carrying a conviction that bordered on religious faith. "A mother knows these things. I can feel Tommy calling for me." Carol Harris chose a different path through grief, one that led inward rather than outward, into a silence so profound it seemed to swallow sound itself. She stopped answering the phone, stopped opening the curtains, stopped doing anything that acknowledged the world beyond her son's empty bedroom. Friends and neighbors brought casseroles that rotted untouched in her refrigerator, and mail piled up on her front porch like autumn leaves. The guilt consumed her in ways that Linda's anger never could, a relentless whisper that reminded her she should have said no to the fishing trip, should have insisted the boys stay home, should have somehow prevented the unpreventable. The bedroom Jake had occupied since childhood became Carol's shrine and torture chamber, a space she couldn't enter but couldn't bear to close. His fishing magazines lay open on the desk where he'd left them, bookmarked to articles about night fishing techniques and catfish behavior. His school clothes hung in the closet, still carrying the faint scent of teenage boy cologne and summer sweat. On his dresser sat a photograph from the previous Christmas, showing Jake and Tommy grinning beside a string of bass they'd caught at Lake Martin, their arms slung around each other's shoulders in the easy camaraderie of boys who'd never imagined their friendship could end. The sisters' different approaches to loss created a chasm between them when they needed each other most. Linda interpreted Carol's withdrawal as giving up, while Carol saw Linda's relentless activity as denial of reality. Family gatherings that had once been joyous occasions became exercises in endured pain, with empty chairs that seemed to grow larger and more conspicuous with each passing week. Dennis Wilson tried to bridge the gap between the women, understanding that grief manifests differently in everyone, but even his patient wisdom couldn't heal wounds this deep. The community rallied around both families with the fierce loyalty that small towns reserve for their own in times of crisis. The Perdido Creek Baptist Church organized prayer vigils that filled the sanctuary with candlelight and whispered supplications. Local businesses contributed to a reward fund that grew to nearly $15,000, a substantial sum for a county where most families lived paycheck to paycheck. But as summer turned to fall and fall turned to winter, the well-meaning gestures of support began to feel more like reminders of what couldn't be recovered than expressions of hope for what might still be found. Sheriff Bobby Ray Hutchins had learned law enforcement the hard way, working his way up from deputy to detective to sheriff through 15 years of dealing with domestic disputes, drunk drivers, and the occasional burglary that made headlines in the Crenshaw County Gazette. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for a case where two teenagers could vanish without leaving behind a single useful clue. The Crenshaw County Sheriff's Department operated on a budget that barely covered basic patrol functions, with 4 full-time deputies, 1 detective, and equipment that had seen better decades. When faced with a missing persons case of this magnitude, Hutchins quickly discovered the gap between what television crime shows promised and what small-town police work could actually deliver. The initial investigation followed every protocol Hutchins knew, beginning with a thorough examination of the scene at Perdido Creek. State Bureau of Investigation agents processed the abandoned truck and scattered fishing gear for fingerprints, finding dozens of partial prints that belonged to the boys, their friends, and family members who had handled the equipment over the years. The truck's interior yielded nothing unusual: empty Coca-Cola cans, a bag of pork rinds, fishing licenses properly displayed on the dashboard, and 87 cents in loose change scattered across the bench seat. Everything pointed to two boys who had arrived at their fishing spot with perfectly ordinary intentions, and no indication they expected anything but a successful night of catching catfish. Detective Ray Morrison, borrowed from the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department, brought urban crime scene expertise to rural Alabama, but even his experience faltered when confronted with a case that defied logical explanation. Morrison interviewed everyone who had seen or spoken to the boys in the days leading up to their disappearance, creating a timeline that revealed nothing more sinister than typical teenage summer activities. Jake had worked his usual shift at Henderson's hardware store on the afternoon of July 14th, helping customers load fertilizer and discussing fishing spots with local farmers. Tommy had spent the morning helping his father at the auto repair shop, his hands stained with transmission fluid and his mind focused on the night fishing adventure they'd planned. The absence of witnesses proved the investigation's greatest obstacle. Perdido Creek ran through some of the most isolated country in southern Alabama, miles from the nearest house and accessible only by a network of hunting trails that most people avoided after dark. The boys had chosen their fishing spot specifically for its remoteness, the same quality that now made it impossible to find anyone who might have seen what happened to them. Morrison and his team interviewed hunters, farmers, and anyone else who regularly traveled the back roads of Crenshaw County, but the night of July 15th had passed unremarkably for everyone except two teenage boys who had simply ceased to exist. 3 weeks into the investigation, the first serious theory emerged when Morrison learned about a drifter who had been seen around Crenshaw County in early July. Robert Lee Caldwell, a 34-year-old ex-convict from Mississippi with a history of burglary and assault, had been spotted at a truck stop in nearby Luverne just 2 days before the boys disappeared. Caldwell matched the description of a man who had attempted to break into a farmhouse 15 miles from Perdido Creek, and his criminal record included a juvenile conviction for armed robbery that suggested a willingness to use violence when cornered. For 10 days, the investigation focused entirely on finding Caldwell, with his photograph distributed to law enforcement agencies across 3 states. The Caldwell lead collapsed when the drifter was arrested in Pensacola, Florida, for public intoxication and theft, charges that provided him with an ironclad alibi for the night the boys disappeared. Jail records showed Caldwell had been locked up in the Escambia County facility since July 12th, 3 days before Jake and Tommy vanished. The realization that their most promising suspect couldn't possibly be involved sent the investigation back to square one, with Morrison admitting privately to Hutchins that he was running out of conventional leads to pursue. As autumn arrived, and the initial urgency of the search began to fade, the case files grew thicker while the actual progress remained frustratingly thin. Evidence bags containing the boys' fishing gear sat in a storage room at the sheriff's department, catalogued and photographed, but yielding no secrets. The one piece of evidence that might have told a different story lay ignored among the other items. Jake's base caster rod, found 100 yards from the truck with microscopic traces of blood on the handle that 1995 forensic technology couldn't detect or analyze. That fishing rod would sit in storage for 23 years, waiting for science to catch up with the truth it carried. By the winter of 1996, the Jake Harris and Tommy Wilson case had officially joined the ranks of Alabama's unsolved mysteries, filed away in manila folders that gathered dust alongside dozens of other cold cases that had exhausted every investigative avenue. The reward fund established by the community had grown to $18,000 before contributions stopped coming, the money sitting untouched in a bank account that served as a monument to hope that had slowly calcified into resignation. Sheriff Hutchins kept the case active on paper, but with no new leads and pressure from county commissioners to focus resources on current crimes, the daily urgency that had once driven the investigation faded like summer heat, giving way to autumn's chill. The families adapted to their new reality with the stubborn resilience that defines small-town survival, but the adaptations carved permanent scars into the landscape of their lives. Linda Wilson transformed her obsession with finding Tommy into a broader mission of helping other families navigate the nightmare of missing loved ones. She became the unofficial coordinator for search efforts throughout central Alabama, driving hundreds of miles to assist in cases that echoed her own tragedy. Her kitchen table, once covered with maps and flyers bearing her son's photograph, now hosted meetings for families whose children had vanished into the same inexplicable void that had swallowed Tommy and Jake. Carol Harris chose a different path through the wilderness of loss, one that led her deeper into solitude and away from anything that might trigger memories of her missing son. She sold the house on Maple Street where Jake had grown up, unable to bear passing his empty bedroom each morning, and moved to a small apartment across town where nothing reminded her of what she'd lost. The fishing rod and tackle box Jake had left behind went into storage, too painful to keep but too precious to discard, joining the accumulated artifacts of a life interrupted in its prime. The annual Memorial Fishing Tournament began in the summer of 1997. Organized by Tommy's father Dennis and several local anglers who refused to let the boy's memory fade into footnotes in old newspaper clippings. Every July 15th, dozens of boats gathered at Perdido Creek for a day of fishing that served as both celebration and mourning, a community's way of saying the boys' names aloud when their families found speaking those names too difficult. The tournament raised money for college scholarships, awarded to local students who demonstrated the same love of outdoors activities that had defined Jake and Tommy's friendship, creating something positive from a tragedy that had offered nothing but questions. The silence that settled over the case wasn't complete absence, but rather the white noise of time passing without resolution. Occasional tips still trickled into the sheriff's department, a hunter claiming to have found bones that turned out to belong to deer, a psychic from Mobile insisting she could locate the boys through spiritual communication, travelers passing through who thought they'd seen teenagers matching the descriptions in distant states. Each lead required investigation, each investigation ended in disappointment, and each disappointment drove the case further into the realm of local legend rather than active police work. Detective Morrison, who had borrowed time from Montgomery County to work the case, returned to his regular duties with the bitter taste of failure lingering in his professional pride. He'd worked hundreds of cases during his career, but the Wilson-Harris disappearance remained the one that haunted his dreams, the puzzle he couldn't solve even when logic suggested no solution existed. Before leaving Crenshaw County, he made Sheriff Hutchins promise to call if any new evidence emerged, no matter how minor it might seem, because Morrison understood that cold cases sometimes thaw when investigators least expect breakthrough moments. The evidence room at the Crenshaw County Sheriff's Department became an unintentional museum of interrupted lives, housing not just the boys' fishing gear, but also items from other unsolved cases that stretched back decades. Jake's basecaster rod sat in evidence bag Bushran 337, catalogued and photographed but forgotten among the detritus of crimes that time had rendered academic rather than urgent. The blood traces on that rod's handle remained invisible to 1990s forensic technology, their secrets locked away like messages in bottles, floating in an ocean of bureaucratic indifference. Years passed, with the relentless persistence of water wearing away stone, each season marking another anniversary of questions without answers. The community learned to live with the empty space the boys had left behind, the way people adapt to missing limbs or chronic pain that never quite disappears but becomes incorporated into daily existence. Their story became part of Crenshaw County's folklore, whispered among teenagers who dared each other to fish at Perdido Creek after dark, passed down through generations as a cautionary tale about how quickly ordinary lives can intersect with inexplicable darkness. Detective Sarah Martinez arrived at the Crenshaw County Sheriff's Department on a humid September morning in 2018, carrying 23 years of law enforcement experience and a reputation for breathing life into cases that others had declared clinically dead. Martinez had transferred from Birmingham's Major Crimes Unit specifically to work cold cases in rural Alabama, drawn by the challenge of applying modern investigative techniques to mysteries that had stumped previous generations of detectives. At 48, she possessed the patience that comes with understanding how justice sometimes moves at geological speed, and the technological knowledge to recognize opportunities that earlier investigators couldn't have imagined. The current sheriff, David Coleman, who had inherited the position when Hutchins retired in 2010, gave Martinez free rein to review any case files that captured her interest. The evidence room had been reorganized twice since 1995, but the Wilson Harris case materials remained exactly where Detective Morrison had left them, occupying 3 cardboard boxes and 2 evidence bags that had been moved but never reopened. Martinez spent her first week reading every report, interview transcript and photograph, reconstructing the investigation in her mind while making notes about leads that 21st century technology might pursue differently. What struck Martinez immediately was how thoroughly the original investigation had been conducted within the limitations of 1990s police work. Morrison and Hutchins had interviewed every potential witness, processed the crime scene according to contemporary standards, and followed logical investigative pathways until they reached dead ends that couldn't be overcome with available resources. But Martinez also recognized gaps that modern techniques could address, particularly in the area of forensic evidence that had been collected but never fully analyzed due to technological constraints. The fishing rod found 100 yards from the abandoned truck caught Martinez's attention because of its location and condition. According to Morrison's notes, the rod had been discovered partially hidden beneath a fallen log, positioned in a way that suggested it had been thrown or dropped rather than simply lost during a normal fishing expedition. The rod's distance from the truck bothered Martinez because it implied either a struggle that had extended well beyond the immediate fishing spot or deliberate placement by someone trying to dispose of evidence. Most significantly, Morrison's report mentioned that the rod appeared to have dark stains on the handle, but 1995 forensic capabilities couldn't determine what those stains contained. Martinez arranged for the fishing rod to be transported to the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences laboratory in Montgomery, where DNA analysis technology had advanced exponentially since the case went cold. The laboratory technicians who received evidence bag Ledger 337 worked with microscopic samples that would have been impossible to detect or analyze in 1995, using polymerase chain reaction amplification to identify genetic material from traces so small they were invisible to the naked eye. The process required 6 weeks to complete, but Martinez had learned during her Birmingham years that patience often provided the key to unlocking mysteries that haste had failed to solve. While waiting for the laboratory results, Martinez re-interviewed family members and community witnesses, approaching familiar territory with fresh perspectives shaped by decades of technological advancement. Linda Wilson, now in her early 60s, had never stopped believing that Tommy and Jake's case could be solved, and she greeted Martinez's involvement with cautious optimism tempered by 23 years of disappointment. Carol Harris proved more difficult to locate and interview, having retreated so completely from her previous life that Martinez required 3 weeks to track her down to a small apartment in Montgomery, where she worked as a night shift clerk at a convenience store. The DNA results arrived on a Thursday morning in November 2018, delivered in a manila envelope that Martinez opened with hands that trembled slightly despite her professional composure. The laboratory had successfully extracted genetic material from blood traces on the fishing rod's cork handle, and that DNA profile had been run through the combined DNA index system database that linked crime laboratories across the United States. The profile had generated a match to a convicted felon whose genetic information had been entered into the system following a 2003 armed robbery conviction in Mississippi. Robert Sullivan, known to friends and police records as Bobby, was 52 years old and currently serving a 15-year sentence at the Mississippi State Penitentiary for robbery and weapons charges. His criminal history stretched back to juvenile court in the 1980s, including arrests for burglary, assault, and theft in Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida. Most importantly, for Martinez's investigation, Sullivan's whereabouts during the summer of 1995 placed him in central Alabama, working construction jobs and staying in cheap motels while moving from town to town in a pattern that law enforcement recognized as typical for career criminals avoiding long-term scrutiny. The DNA match represented the breakthrough Martinez had hoped to find, but it also opened new questions about how Sullivan's blood had ended up on Jake Harris's fishing rod and what role he had played in the boy's disappearance. Detective Martinez made the drive to Mississippi State Penitentiary on a cold December morning in 2018, the 2-hour journey from Crenshaw County, giving her time to prepare mentally for an interview that could finally provide answers to questions that had haunted two families for over 2 decades. The prison sat like a concrete monument to human failure in the flat Mississippi Delta, surrounded by fields that stretched endlessly toward horizons broken only by guard towers and razor wire. Martinez had interviewed hundreds of inmates during her career, but this conversation carried weight that pressed against her chest like a physical burden. The accumulated grief of parents who had never learned what happened to their children. Robert Sullivan appeared smaller than his arrest record suggested, the kind of diminishment that long-term incarceration imposes on men who once believed themselves dangerous. At 52, his hair had gone completely grey, and his face carried the pallor of someone who spent most days in artificial light. His hands bore the scars and calluses of construction work, but they trembled slightly as he sat across from Martinez in the interview room, suggesting either medical issues or nervous anticipation of why a detective from Alabama had requested this meeting. Sullivan's eyes darted constantly between Martinez's face and the manila folder she'd placed on the table between them, as if he already suspected what information that folder contained. Martinez had learned during her years in Birmingham that confession often emerged not from aggressive interrogation, but from patient conversation that allowed suspects to tell their stories at their own pace. She began by discussing Sullivan's current situation, his family background, and his work history, establishing a rapport that might encourage honesty when the conversation turned to more difficult subjects. Sullivan responded with the careful politeness of someone accustomed to dealing with authority figures, answering questions directly but volunteering nothing beyond what was specifically asked. The breakthrough came when Martinez opened the manila folder and withdrew an 8x10 photograph of Jake's fishing rod. The same image that had been taken in 1995, but enlarged to show details that weren't visible in the original crime scene photos. Sullivan's reaction was immediate and unmistakable, a sharp intake of breath followed by a visible tremor that ran through his entire body. His hands moved involuntarily toward the photograph before he caught himself and placed them flat on the table. But Martinez had seen enough reactions to know she was looking at recognition rather than confusion. "Do you remember this fishing rod, Bobby?" Martinez asked, her voice carrying the gentle persistence of someone who already knew the answer. Sullivan stared at the photograph for nearly 30 seconds without speaking, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. When he finally looked up, Martinez could see tears forming in his eyes, and she recognized the expression of someone whose carefully constructed defenses were beginning to crumble under the weight of long-buried guilt. The DNA evidence gave Martinez leverage that previous investigators had lacked, scientific proof that connected Sullivan to a crime scene in ways that couldn't be explained by coincidence or mistaken identity. She explained how modern forensic techniques had extracted his genetic material from blood traces on the fishing rod's handle, how that profile had been matched to his convicted feeder status in the national database, and how his documented presence in Alabama during July 1995 placed him in the exact location where two teenage boys had vanished without explanation. Sullivan's attorney, a court-appointed public defender who had driven over from Jackson for the interview, advised his client to remain silent. But Martinez could see that 23 years of carrying this secret had exhausted the man sitting across from her. The weight of what he'd done had been pressing down on him for more than 2 decades, growing heavier with each passing year until the burden had become unbearable. Prison had given Sullivan time to think about his choices and their consequences, time to understand the magnitude of what he'd taken from 2 families who had never stopped searching for answers. "I've been waiting for this day for a long time," Sullivan finally whispered, his voice barely audible in the small interview room. "I knew someday the truth would catch up with me. I just never thought it would take this long." Martinez leaned forward slightly, maintaining eye contact while preparing to hear details that would finally explain what had happened to Jake Harris and Tommy Wilson on that humid summer night in 1995. The confession began with Sullivan's hands shaking so violently that Martinez had to ask the guard to bring him a cup of water, watching as the man who had carried this secret for 23 years struggled to find words for what he'd done. The interview room felt smaller somehow, as if the weight of approaching truth was pressing against the walls, and Martinez found herself holding her breath as Sullivan began to speak in a voice that cracked with emotion and exhaustion. His attorney sat silent beside him, understanding that some secrets become too heavy to carry, and that his client had reached the point where confession offered the only possibility of psychological relief. "I was robbing houses that summer," Sullivan began, his eyes fixed on the table rather than meeting Martinez's gaze. "Rural places, farms mostly, where people didn't lock their doors and kept cash hidden in coffee cans and jewelry boxes. I'd been doing it for months, moving from county to county, never staying in one place long enough for the law to connect the dots." His voice carried the flat effect of someone recounting events that felt simultaneously distant and immediate, memories he'd tried to bury but could never quite escape. The night of July 15th, Sullivan had been burglarizing a farmhouse about 5 miles from Perdido Creek when the homeowner's dog began barking, forcing him to flee before completing the theft. He'd been driving his stolen pickup truck along back roads, looking for another opportunity, when he spotted the glow of a campfire near the creek access road. Thinking he might find an unattended campsite with valuables left behind, Sullivan had parked his truck and approached on foot, moving through the trees with the careful stealth of someone accustomed to taking what didn't belong to him. Instead of an empty campsite, Sullivan discovered two teenage boys fishing by lamplight, their voices carrying clearly across the water as they discussed school, girls, and their hopes for a successful night of catching catfish. Tommy and Jake were so focused on their fishing that they didn't notice Sullivan watching from the tree line, and for several minutes he considered simply leaving them alone and finding easier prey elsewhere. But then Jake had turned toward the woods, his flashlight beam sweeping across the darkness, and Sullivan realized the boy had seen his truck parked on the access road. "The kid with the flashlight started pointing toward where I'd left my truck," Sullivan continued, his voice growing steadier as the story gained momentum. "He was telling his cousin that someone else was out there, that maybe they should go check it out. I knew they'd seen the truck, and I knew they'd remember it if anyone came asking questions later. That truck was stolen, and I couldn't afford to have witnesses who could put me in the area." What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of violence meeting innocence in a place where no one could hear screams for help. Sullivan approached the boys with his hands raised, claiming he was lost and asking for directions. But Jake Harris possessed the kind of intuitive wariness that comes from growing up in a world where strangers appearing at fishing spots after midnight usually meant trouble. When Jake picked up his fishing rod and suggested they should all head back to the truck together, Sullivan panicked, grabbing for the rod and striking the teenager across the head when Jake tried to resist. The blow from his own fishing rod dropped Jake Harris, unconscious, into the shallow water at the creek's edge, his blood mixing with the dark current, while Tommy Wilson stood frozen in shock, unable to process what he'd just witnessed. Sullivan described how time seemed to slow down in that moment, how he could hear Tommy trying to say his cousin's name but no sound emerging from the boy's throat, how the lamplight cast everything in hellish shadows that made the violence seem surreal and disconnected from normal human experience. "I didn't plan to hurt them," Sullivan whispered, tears streaming down his face as he relived the worst moments of his life. "But once it started, I couldn't stop it. The other boy was screaming for help, and I knew sound carries far over water at night. I knew someone might hear him and come looking." Tommy Wilson's death came quickly, Sullivan's hands around the 15-year-old's throat until his struggles ceased, and the only sounds remaining were the gentle lapping of creek water against the muddy banks and the distant call of a screech owl hidden somewhere in the darkness. The disposal of the bodies required the kind of grim logistics that career criminals understand instinctively. Sullivan loaded both teenagers into his stolen truck and drove 20 miles to an abandoned mine shaft he'd discovered during his reconnaissance of potential burglary targets. The mine had been closed since the 1960s, its entrance partially concealed by kudzu vines and warning signs so faded they were barely legible. He dropped Jake and Tommy into that dark hole, listening to their bodies hit bottom somewhere far below, before returning to Perdido Creek to scatter their fishing gear and create the appearance of an accident or voluntary disappearance. Sullivan finished his confession by describing how he'd fled Alabama the next morning, abandoning the stolen truck in Mississippi and hitchhiking to Florida, where he'd spent months looking over his shoulder and expecting police to appear at any moment. But the months stretched into years, and gradually Sullivan began to believe he'd escaped consequences for what he'd done, until science finally caught up with the truth he'd tried to bury. Detective Martinez stood at the edge of the abandoned mine shaft on a frigid January morning in 2019, watching as the Alabama Bureau of Investigation's recovery team prepared equipment that would finally bring Jake Harris and Tommy Wilson home after 23 years in the darkness below. The mine entrance yawned like a wound in the earth, partially hidden by decades of kudzu growth that had been carefully cut away to allow access for the specialized gear required to retrieve remains from depths that conventional methods couldn't reach. Sullivan had led them here 2 weeks earlier, his shackled hands pointing toward landmarks he remembered with disturbing clarity, his voice flat and emotionless as he described how he'd disposed of 2 teenage boys as if they were nothing more than inconvenient evidence. The families had gathered, despite Martinez's gentle suggestion that they might prefer to wait for news rather than witness the recovery process firsthand. Linda Wilson stood wrapped in a heavy coat that couldn't quite ward off the chill that had nothing to do with January temperatures, her face carrying an expression of grim determination that had sustained her through more than 2 decades of uncertainty. Carol Harris had made the drive from Montgomery, her first visit to Crenshaw County since moving away years earlier, and she appeared fragile as autumn leaves, as if the approaching resolution might finally allow her to crumble completely after holding herself together through sheer force of will. The technical rescue team lowered cameras into the mine shaft first, sending back grainy images that confirmed what Sullivan's confession had promised. At a depth of nearly 40 feet, human remains lay scattered across the rocky bottom, preserved by the cool, dry conditions that had turned the abandoned mine into an unintentional tomb. The team worked with painstaking care, understanding that these weren't just evidence to be collected, but the mortal remains of children whose families had spent decades wondering where they were sleeping their final sleep. Dr. Sarah Chen, the forensic anthropologist brought in from the University of Alabama, descended into the mine with the recovery team, her equipment designed to ensure that every bone fragment and personal artifact would be documented and preserved. The process required most of the day, with each item carefully photographed in place before being lifted to the surface in specialized containers that would protect the remains during transport to the State Forensic Laboratory. As the afternoon light began to fade, the team brought up items that transformed the case from abstract investigation to heartbreaking reality. Jake's wallet, still containing his driver's license and a photograph of a girl he'd been dating. Tommy's class ring from Crenshaw County High School, fragments of clothing that mothers recognized despite decades of decay. The identification process, while technically necessary, felt like a formality, given Sullivan's detailed confession and the personal effects recovered from the mine. Dental records confirmed what the families already knew in their hearts, providing the official closure that legal proceedings would require, but offering little comfort to parents who had already accepted the worst possible outcome. Dr. Chen worked with respectful efficiency, understanding that these remains represented not just forensic evidence, but the physical foundation for grief that could finally be acknowledged and processed. Linda Wilson's reaction to the recovery surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of the overwhelming relief she'd expected to feel, she experienced a profound emptiness that felt almost worse than the uncertainty she'd lived with for so long. At least when they were missing, I could imagine they might still be alive somewhere, she told Martinez during one of their conversations in the weeks following the recovery. Now I have to accept that they've been dead all this time, that all those years I spent hoping and searching were for nothing. The finality of death, even death that had occurred decades earlier, carried its own unique burden of grief. Carol Harris found a different kind of peace in the recovery, describing it as the lifting of a weight she'd carried so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. For 23 years, she'd lived with the terrible possibility that Jake was suffering somewhere, that he might be calling for her help while she remained powerless to respond. Death, even violent death, offered a form of resolution that disappearance never could, allowing her to finally mourn properly for a son she'd lost but never been able to bury. The legal proceedings that would follow Sullivan's confession were almost anticlimactic compared to the emotional weight of recovery and identification. Prosecutors in both Alabama and Mississippi worked together to ensure that Sullivan would face justice for what he'd done, but no sentence could restore what the families had lost or compensate for decades of uncertainty and pain. The funeral service for Jake Harris and Tommy Wilson took place on a warm Saturday morning in March 2019, exactly 23 years and 8 months after they disappeared into a summer night that had refused to give up its secrets until science finally forced the truth into the light. Perdido Creek Baptist Church overflowed with mourners who had waited decades to say goodbye properly. 3 generations of Crenshaw County residents united in grief that had been delayed but never diminished by the passage of time. The closed caskets at the front of the sanctuary seemed impossibly small, a visual reminder that the community was finally laying to rest 2 boys who had never had the chance to become the men they dreamed of becoming. Detective Martinez sat in the back of the church, watching as family members and friends shared memories of Jake and Tommy that had been preserved like photographs in albums, unchanged by time and untouched by the knowledge of how their stories had ended. She'd attended dozens of funerals during her career, but this service carried a weight that pressed against her chest like physical pressure, the accumulated grief of parents who had spent decades not knowing whether to hope or mourn. Linda Wilson spoke about her son's love of fishing and his plans to study marine biology, dreams that had died with him in an abandoned mine shaft 20 miles from where he'd cast his last line into Perdido Creek. Carol Harris remained silent during the service, her face composed but her hands trembling as she held a program that featured photographs of both boys taken during happier times. Martinez understood that some grief runs too deep for public expression, that Carol's healing would happen in private moments and quiet conversations rather than shared testimonials. The detective had seen enough families destroyed by violence to recognize the different ways people process trauma, and she respected Carol's choice to remember her son privately rather than publicly celebrating a life that had been cut short by senseless brutality. The case had become Martinez's defining achievement in a career filled with successful investigations. But victory felt hollow when measured against the cost paid by families who had endured decades of uncertainty. Modern forensic science had finally provided answers that 1990s technology couldn't deliver, proving that time and persistence could sometimes overcome even the most carefully hidden crimes. The DNA evidence that convicted Sullivan represented the kind of breakthrough that cold case investigators dream about, but Martinez found herself reflecting on the randomness of justice delayed rather than celebrating justice served. Sullivan received 2 life sentences without possibility of parole, 1 for each boy he'd murdered, ensuring that he would spend his remaining years in the same kind of concrete box where Martinez had interviewed him months earlier. The sentencing hearing provided legal closure, but offered little emotional satisfaction to families who had lost too much to feel vindicated by punishment that came too late to matter. Dennis Wilson told reporters afterward that knowing Sullivan would die in prison didn't bring his son back or restore the 23 years of uncertainty his family had endured. The annual memorial fishing tournament continued every July 15th, but its character changed after the boys' remains were recovered and buried. What had once been a celebration of hope mixed with mourning became purely commemorative, a community's way of ensuring that Jake Harris and Tommy Wilson wouldn't be forgotten even after their story had finally reached its conclusion. The tournament raised enough money to establish a permanent scholarship fund that would help other young people pursue their dreams, creating something positive from tragedy that had offered nothing but pain for more than 2 decades. Martinez returned to her office at the Crenshaw County Sheriff's Department with a renewed understanding of how fragile the line between solved and unsolved cases could be. The evidence room still contained dozens of boxes from investigations that had reached dead ends, families still waiting for phone calls that might never come, mysteries that time had sealed rather than solved. Jake's fishing rod, once evidence bag, letter 337, was now part of a court record that documented how microscopic traces of blood had survived long enough to identify a killer who thought he'd escaped consequences for his crimes. The Wilson-Harris case became a teaching example for forensic science programs and law enforcement academies, demonstrating how technological advances could breathe life into investigations that seemed hopelessly cold. But for the families involved, the case would always represent something more personal than investigative success, a reminder that love doesn't disappear when people die, and that some questions are worth asking for decades until science finally provides answers. If you've followed this journey into the darkest corners of rural crime, remember that behind every cold case file lies a family still hoping for resolution, still believing that truth has a way of surfacing even when it seems buried beyond recovery. And your engagement with these stories helps ensure that the forgotten victims are never truly forgotten.